The man at the head of the table looked at Della like she was something that had wandered in from the street and hadn't figured out yet that it didn't belong. His name was Clifton Waverly. He owned the bank, the mill, and approximately half the opinion in Harrow Creek, Wyoming. He had a wife who wore silk on weekdays, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, and he had a son named Fletcher who had just announced, loudly enough for the entire dining room to hear, that he couldn't imagine what possessed Sheriff Bo Hartley to bring a laundress's daughter to the Waverly table. Bo didn't flinch. He pulled out Della's chair, waited until she sat, and then took his own seat across from Fletcher, with the particular stillness of a man who has decided exactly how much of himself he intends to spend on this moment. "She's here," Bo said, "because I asked her. Same reason anyone's anywhere." Fletcher laughed. It was the kind of laugh that expected the room to join in. The room did not join in. Della Marsh had grown up on the east side of Harrow Creek, which was the side people meant when they said that side. Her mother, Ruth, had taken in laundry since before Della could remember. Other people's shirts and bed sheets and tablecloths, boiled and wrung and hung to dry in the yard, while the neighbors on their side of town nodded in recognition, and the neighbors on the other side pretended not to see the line at all. Della's father had died when she was 9. She didn't talk about that much. What she did talk about, when she talked at all, was the county land office on Sutter Street, and the deed her mother had held for 22 years on the half-acre behind their house, and the letter that had arrived 6 weeks ago informing Ruth Marsh that the deed was invalid. The property had been foreclosed on a technicality in 1908, and they had 30 days to vacate. The letter had come from Waverly Savings and Trust. Della had read it 4 times. Then she had folded it very carefully, put it in her coat pocket, and walked the 3 miles to the county courthouse to pull every land record she could find with her mother's name on it. She was on her second hour at the records desk when Bo Hartley walked in. He wasn't there for her. He was there because he was sheriff, and sheriffs had business at courthouses, the same way rivers had business at the sea. But he'd noticed her. It was hard not to notice a woman's standing at a records desk with the focused energy of someone disarming a bomb, and he'd asked, the way he always asked, simply, "What are you looking for?" She'd told him. He hadn't said anything for a long moment. Then he'd said, "I know those records. I pulled them myself 2 years ago when Pete Alderson got the same letter. What happened to Pete Alderson?" He left. Most people do. Della had looked at him very directly. "I'm not most people." Bo had considered that. He was a tall man, lean in the way of someone who worked hard and ate when he remembered to, with gray already coming in at his temples, though he wasn't yet 40. He had a reputation in Harrow Creek for being fair, which meant different things to different people, but in practice meant that he applied the law the same way whether you had money or didn't, which made him genuinely liked by half the town and quietly resented by the other half. "No," he'd said finally. "I don't think you are." The dinner invitation had come a week later, and Della had almost refused it. Not because she didn't want to go. She'd understood immediately what Bo was doing, putting her in a room with Clifton Waverly, on Waverly's own ground, so that Waverly would have to look at her and know that someone was looking back. It was a move, and it was a smart one, and she respected it. What gave her pause was the dress. She had one good dress. It had been her mother's, altered twice. Once when Ruth had lost weight after the grief of Della's father, and once when Della had grown into her mother's frame at 17. It was dark blue wool with ivory buttons, and it was perfectly respectable, and it was also visibly not the kind of dress that women wore to Waverly dinners. Her neighbor, Agnes Pruitt, 63 years old, sharp as a tack, former seamstress, had looked at the dress and then looked at Della and said, "Wear it anyway." "It's not right for. It's yours," Agnes said. "That's what's right about it." Della wore it. She walked into the Waverly house with her back straight and her hands quiet at her sides, and she sat down at that table, and when Fletcher Waverly laughed at her, she did not look away from him. She looked directly at him, the way you look at something you are measuring, and Fletcher, who was not accustomed to being measured, stopped laughing first. Clifton Waverly watched this with the expression of a man recalculating something. "Miss Marsh," he said with the careful warmth of a man who knows how to use warmth as a tool, "we've heard your family has had some difficulty with the property records. I want you to know we take these matters very seriously at the bank." "I know you do," Della said. "That's why I came." There was a beat of silence. "Our records," Clifton continued. indicate a lapse in payment in October of 1908, Della said. I know. I've read the record. I've also read the payment ledger from First Territorial, which was the bank that held the note before you acquired it in 1911. The October payment is recorded as received. The record at your bank shows it as missed. One of those two documents is wrong. Clifton's expression didn't change, exactly. But something behind it did. Fletcher was no longer smiling. Beau sat across the table with his coffee cup and said nothing which Della understood was its own kind of statement. That's a very serious allegation, Clifton said. It's an observation, Della said. The allegation would come later, if someone wanted to make one. Harrow Creek had a way of talking that moved faster than the weather. By the next morning, half the town knew that Ruth Marsh's daughter had sat at Clifton Waverly's table and told him to his face that his bank records didn't match First Territorial's ledger. By afternoon, the story had acquired the detail that she'd done it in a blue dress that cost less than his wife's earrings and hadn't blinked once. By evening, old Herschel Boone, who had farmed the same land for 40 years and gotten a similar letter 3 years ago and left for his daughter's place in Colorado, was mentioned in at least 6 separate conversations. Nobody connected the dots out loud, but the dots were there. Della was aware of the talk. She couldn't afford to care about it. Or rather, she could care. But she couldn't let it change what she was doing, which was spending every free hour at the county records office and the state archive and the reading room of the Harrow Creek Gazette, pulling every land transaction Waverly Savings and Trust had conducted in the county going back to 1911. She wasn't a lawyer, she knew that. She had an 8th grade education and 18 months of night school correspondence courses, and a mind that worked like a card catalog, everything filed, nothing lost. What she needed was someone who could take what she was finding and do something legal with it. That someone turned out to be Harriet Fowler. Harriet Fowler was 61 years old, had been practicing law in Harrow Creek for 22 years, and was one of approximately 4 women admitted to the Wyoming bar before 1920. She had an office above the hardware store that smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper, and she had a reputation for taking cases nobody else would touch, which had made her wealthy in experience and comfortable in money, and completely indifferent to the opinion of Clifton Waverly. When Della spread her documents across Harriet's desk, the payment ledger copies, the deed records, the acquisition files, the transfer documents from First Territorial, Harriet had read through them in silence for 40 minutes. Then she'd said, "How many properties?" "7 that I can document completely," Della said. "Another 4 where I have most of it. And you found this yourself. My mother's property is one of the 7. Harriet had looked at her for a long moment. "How much are they paying you at the laundry?" $14 a week. I'll match it," Harriet said. "Come work for me while we build this case. I need someone who can read a ledger the way you just read one." Della had thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. When do I start? The next 6 weeks were the longest of Della's life, and also, in a way she hadn't expected, the best. She learned that she was good at this, at the particular kind of patience that legal work required, at the attention to detail, at the ability to hold 20 connected pieces of information in her head simultaneously and see where they fit. Harriet taught her how to file motions, how to read a deposition, how to write a letter that said exactly what it meant and nothing it didn't. She also learned that Herschel Boone had not been the only one. There was Mabel Cotter, who had lost her farm in 1914. There was the Okafor family, who had left town in 1917 with nothing but what they could carry. There was Jim Stroud, still in Harrow Creek, still bitter about it, who had spent 4 years assuming the fault was his own. Della drove out to see Jim Stroud on a Tuesday in October, with Harriet's authorization and a folder of documents. He was a weathered man, mid-50s, with the particular wariness of someone who'd been wrong about something important and hadn't finished being angry about it. She laid the documents on his kitchen table. She showed him the payment record. She showed him the discrepancy. Jim Stroud looked at the papers for a long time. Then he looked up at Della. "I paid that mortgage," he said, "every month. I paid it." "I know," Della said. "That's what the ledger shows." Something shifted in his face. It wasn't quite relief, because relief implies the fear is over, and the fear wasn't over yet. It was something closer to the feeling of being believed, which is its own different thing and sometimes more important. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Della said, We take it to the county judge. Bo had been careful the whole time about what he was and wasn't. He was the sheriff. He couldn't be a witness in a civil proceeding he was also investigating. He couldn't appear to be partial. He had rules he lived by, and they weren't just professional. They were the architecture of who he was. And Della respected that even when it frustrated her. What he could do was pull the acquisition records from 1911, which he was entitled to as part of a routine administrative review. What he could do was note, in writing, that the transfer documents from First Territorial contained a signature that didn't match the bank president's signature on file elsewhere. What he could do was make sure that the county judge, Harrison Ellsworth, received a copy of that note before the preliminary hearing. He could also, on a Wednesday evening in November, bring Della a bowl of her mother's soup that Ruth had sent with him, and sit across from her at the kitchen table while she went over her notes, and say nothing because nothing needed to be said. Della looked up from her papers at some point and realized she'd been talking for 20 minutes, explaining the case, the timeline, the gaps she still needed to fill, and Bo had just been listening, the way he always listened, like he had nowhere else to be and no part of himself withheld. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was a version of this conversation that would have taken another hour, and a version that was finished in that moment. And they both seemed to arrive at the same conclusion about which version this was. "Thank you," Della said, "for the courthouse, for seeing it. You would have found it without me, maybe, but you didn't walk past." He was quiet for a moment. "My father lost land," he said. "Different circumstances. Long time ago, I've never been able to walk past something like that." Della nodded. She understood things that were carried forward from parents, the weight of them, the way they shaped what you couldn't tolerate. "I'm going to win this," she said. Not with bravado, just as a statement of fact. "I know," Bo said. "I've known since the courthouse." The preliminary hearing was on a Monday. Harriet presented the evidence in her particular style, which was unhurried and precise, the way a person dismantles something complicated without making it look complicated. Judge Ellsworth was a man who had seen a great many things in 30 years on the bench, and he was not easily impressed, but he read the payment ledger copies carefully, and he looked at the signature discrepancy in the transfer documents, and his face did a thing that courtroom observers learned to read, as this is going to matter. Clifton Waverly's attorney, a man from Cheyenne, brought in specially, which told its own story, argued technical procedure and the validity of the bank's standing records. He was good at it. He had the particular confidence of a man who has argued from strength so long he has forgotten what it feels like not to. Harriet let him finish. Then she put Jim Stroud on the stand. Jim Stroud was not a polished witness. He was a tired man who had spent 4 years blaming himself for something that wasn't his fault, and when he talked about it, you felt the specific heaviness of unjust self-blame, the years of it, the way it sits on a person. He had paid his mortgage. He had records. He had never understood why the bank said he hadn't, had assumed he'd made some error he couldn't find. Then Harriet put Mabel Cotter on the stand. Then the son of the Okafor family, now grown, who had driven back from Nebraska to testify. Then 2 more. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, the energy in the courtroom changed. It was a subtle thing. The way people shifted in their seats, the way the back of Clifton Waverly's neck got very still. Fletcher Waverly, who had come to watch with the easy certainty of someone expecting vindication, was no longer looking at the front of the room. Judge Ellsworth called a recess. Della sat in the hallway with Harriet and drank water and didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Either it held or it didn't. Either the documents were enough or they weren't. She'd done everything she could find to do. Agnes Pruitt had come, of course she had, and was sitting 2 seats down with her hands folded in her lap, watching Della the way she'd watched her since she was a child, with the particular attention of someone who has decided you're worth watching. "You're doing fine," Agnes said. "I haven't done anything yet. You've done everything," Agnes said. "The rest is just waiting." The recess lasted 45 minutes. When Judge Ellsworth returned, he said the following, in the measured cadence of a man who chose his words, the way a carpenter chose his materials, that the payment records from First Territorial represented prima facie evidence of valid mortgage payments across the years in question, that the discrepancy between those records and the records held by Waverly Savings and Trust required, at minimum, an independent audit by the state banking commissioner. That pending that audit, no foreclosure actions currently initiated by Waverly Savings and Trust in Harrow Creek County would proceed. That the court was additionally referring the matter of the signature discrepancy on the 1911 acquisition documents to the county prosecutor's office for review. He said all of this in approximately 4 minutes. Then he stood up, and the room stood with him, and when he left, there was a moment of silence that felt very full. Clifton Waverly left without speaking to anyone. His attorney gathered his papers with the particular efficiency of a man who has already moved on to the next thing. Fletcher Waverly stood near the door for a moment, and Della watched him from across the room, and he looked at her with something complicated in his face that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite respect and landed somewhere in between. Then he left too. The state audit took 3 months. During those 3 months, Della continued working for Harriet. She learned more in those 3 months than she had in the previous 10 years. Not because the material was easy, but because she was finally in the place where the material was being used for something that mattered, which is the best possible condition for learning. Her mother's property was confirmed valid in December. The letter came on a Thursday, and Della brought it home and put it on the kitchen table, and Ruth read it twice, and then sat down very quietly and looked out the window at the backyard, the half-acre they had nearly lost. The line where the clean laundry moved in the winter wind, and didn't say anything for a long time. "Your father would have liked this," Ruth finally said. "He would have done it himself," Della said. "Maybe. But he's not here. You are." In February, the State Banking Commissioner's office filed a formal complaint against Waverly Savings and Trust. The complaint documented 8 cases of fraudulent record alteration, 5 cases of improper foreclosure, and 1 count of document forgery in the acquisition of First Territorial. Clifton Waverly resigned as bank president in March. The bank itself was placed under state receivership. Every property that could be documented as improperly seized was ordered returned to its original owners or their heirs. The county prosecutor filed charges in April. It was a process that would take years to fully resolve. These things always did. But the charges were filed, and that mattered, because it meant that what had happened had a name now, and names have a way of making things real. Harriet offered Della a permanent position. Della said yes, and then she said she wanted to study for the bar exam, and Harriet looked at her over the rim of her reading glasses and said, without any visible surprise whatsoever, "I know. I've been saving the study materials." On the first Saturday in May, Bo Hartley drove out to the Marsh property on the east side of town with no particular stated reason, except that it was a nice morning, and he'd been meaning to check on the fence line along the back, which was a transparent excuse that neither of them felt the need to acknowledge as such. Ruth made coffee, and then found somewhere else to be with the particular tact of a woman who has raised a daughter and knows when to leave the room. Della and Bo sat on the back step with their coffee and looked out at the half-acre, which was just waking up from winter, the first pale green of the grass coming back, the laundry line empty for once, the light coming across the plain in the way it did in early May, flat and gold and clear. "Jim Stroud's planting again," Bo said. "I heard. Mabel Cotter's nephew is coming out from Denver to help with her place. Harriet told me." A bird moved through the brush at the back of the property. The wind came off the plain and smelled like cold and new growth. "Della," Bo said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I haven't asked you anything yet. I know what you're going to ask." He was quiet for a moment. "And?" She looked out at the yard, at the land her mother had worked for and kept and nearly lost, the land that was still here, still theirs, solid under the pale spring morning. She thought about the courthouse, and the records desk, and the way he'd ask simply, "What are you looking for?" And she thought about the 3 months since and what it meant that he had never once told her what she was doing wrong, only sat across from her while she figured out what was right. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath, not with drama, just the particular exhale of a man who'd been holding something for longer than he'd let on. "Good," he said. They sat there for a while longer, in the good quiet of 2 people who don't need to fill the silence, while the spring morning did what spring mornings do, moved forward, without asking permission, into whatever was next. Behind them, through the kitchen window, Ruth Marsh refilled her coffee and watched her daughter sit in the sun and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the ground under all of them was solid and would hold.